At exactly 06:47 a.m. on December 8, 1941, the soul of Detroit changed forever. The morning shift at the Dodge main plant in Hamtramck had just clocked in, their breath visible in the biting Michigan frost. They expected a day like any other, the rhythmic clatter of tools and the assembly of shiny, chrome-laden sedans that represented the peak of American middle-class dreams. But as the static-filled radio reports of Pearl Harbor echoed through the vast 47-acre complex, the dream vanished. The music of peacetime, the steady hum of civilian life, was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. America wasn't just at war. America was behind. Within hours, the aesthetics of the automotive world were discarded. Engineers who had spent their entire careers perfecting the curve of a fender or the plushness of a passenger seat were summoned into closed-door meetings. The air in those conference rooms was thick with cigarette smoke and an unspoken terror. The mission was no longer about profit or style. The question was cold, hard, and existential. How fast could they kill the car to give birth to the engine of war? The Dodge main plant stood as a titan of brick and steel, its 4 stories housing 1,700 windows that had once looked out onto a peaceful Detroit skyline. Built in 1910 by John and Horace Dodge, the plant was a monument to the brothers' belief that American industry could outbuild anyone on Earth. They were titans who had survived the chaos of the early century, but fell victim to the Spanish flu in 1920. They never lived to see their factory's ultimate test, but on this cold December morning, their ghost was in the machinery. By January, those 1,700 windows would no longer reflect the sun. They would be blacked out, hiding the blinding glow of arc welders and the smoke of foundries running 24 hours a day. The transformation had begun. Dodge Main was no longer a factory. It was a fortress of production. To understand the resilience of the engines that would soon power the Allied march, one must look at the men who laid the first bricks in 1910. John and Horace Dodge were not mere businessmen. They were machinists who carried the scent of cutting oil and iron dust in their very pores. They built their reputation on a single, uncompromising word: durability. In 1914, when the U.S. Post Office needed vehicles to survive the bone-shaking, unpaved backroads of rural America, roads that literally pulverized lesser machines, the Dodge brothers delivered. Their engineering philosophy was overbuilt by design. They didn't just meet a specification, they doubled it. They forged components intended to outlast the very vehicles they powered. Although the brothers had been gone for 20 years, their DNA was etched into every pillar of the Hamtramck complex. The War Department didn't just want a motor, they wanted the Dodge Standard. They needed a power plant that could inhale the suffocating sand of the Sahara and claw through the knee-deep mud of a European winter without missed beats. By January 1942, this legacy was being drafted into service. The silent blueprints in the archives were about to become the most important documents in the free world. The transformation of Dodge Main was a feat of industrial violence. Under normal circumstances, reconfiguring a 47-acre facility for an entirely new product would require 6 months of meticulous planning. The War Department gave them 6 weeks. It was a deadline written in blood. On February 2, 1942, the music of peacetime finally died. Foreman Thomas McKinley, a veteran of 19 years on these floors, stood in the center of the main bay as massive cranes hooked onto the last civilian chassis. Workers stopped. The clatter of the factory fell into a haunting silence as the unfinished sedan was hoisted away. It represented the end of an era. The luxury of building what people wanted was gone. They were now building what the world needed to survive. Then, the fury began. Every conveyor, every stamping press, every lathe was ripped out or recalibrated. The foundry needed new molds for a 6-cylinder beast with thicker walls and reinforced bearings. The machine shop had to find a way to achieve tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch on a scale of mass production never before attempted. It was a race against a clock ticking in the lives of soldiers in the Philippines. By March, the lines for luxury sedans were gone, replaced by the raw, cast-iron skeleton of the first T214 prototype. In March 1942, the first T214 prototype coughed into life. It wasn't a masterpiece of aesthetic beauty. It was a 486-pound hunk of raw, uncompromising iron. This was an inline six-cylinder engine, displaced at 230 cubic inches. To a modern ear, 92 horsepower might sound modest, but the T214 wasn't designed for the racetrack. It was designed for torque. It was the kind of low-end, bone-crushing power needed to haul 3/4 of a ton of ammunition through a French swamp or climb a jagged ridge in the Pacific. Every component was a study in survival engineering. The cylinder walls were cast thicker than any civilian model, designed to withstand the thermal violence of being run at full throttle for days on end. But a terrifying flaw emerged during testing. The rear cylinders were cooking themselves to death. The water pump couldn't circulate coolant fast enough to cylinders 5 and 6. A young engineer named Robert Hoos looked at the data and saw a disaster in the making. He proposed a radical redesign of the water jacket geometry. Management hesitated. Retooling would delay delivery by 2 months. But Chrysler made a choice that defined their war effort. Fix it right. They chose delayed perfection over immediate failure, ensuring that when an American soldier turned the key in a desert heat wave, the engine would answer. By May 1942, the plant breathed with the rhythm of 18,000 hearts. The transition to war didn't just change the machines, it changed the faces behind them. As men enlisted or were drafted, a new force arrived, the women of Detroit. They came from the bakeries and kitchens of Hamtramck, like Helen Kowalski. Her hands, once accustomed to the soft texture of Polish dough, now gripped the cold steel of a milling machine. The transition was far from smooth. Many veteran machinists grumbled that women weren't strong enough or technical enough for real work. The women didn't argue with words. They argued with output. Helen swapped her apron for heavy denim coveralls and safety goggles. She learned to cut camshaft lobes to a tolerance of 1,000th of an inch. Every engine she assembled was more than a quota. It was a prayer for her brother Stanley, fighting with the 1st Armored Division in North Africa. Within 6 months, the resentment on the floor vanished, replaced by a grim, shared respect. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster at Dodge, Maine. She was the woman standing in a cloud of oil mist, meeting quotas that the War Department had deemed impossible. The foundry at Dodge, Maine was the closest thing to hell on earth. It was a place of orange fire and suffocating heat, where summer temperatures on the floor regularly hit 115 degrees. Every 45 seconds, like the heartbeat of a giant, molten iron was poured into sand molds. This wasn't ordinary iron. It was the raw material for the T214 blocks, arriving in glowing ladles from Ford's massive River Rouge complex just 10 miles away. The pourers wore thick leather aprons and face shields, their skin constantly slick with sweat and coated in a fine layer of iron dust. To avoid heat exhaustion, they rotated every 30 minutes, a frantic dance of survival. Once the castings cooled, they moved to the shakeout station, where massive vibrating conveyors ripped away the sand. What emerged were black, pitted engine blocks, raw and screaming for refinement. Grinders worked in a permanent cloud of metallic particles. Many refused to wear respirators, finding them too restrictive in the stifling air, unknowingly trading the long-term health of their lungs for the immediate breath needed to meet the day's quota. It was brutal, back-breaking work, but it was the only way to forge a heart strong enough for war. If the foundry was about brute force, the machine shop was about the religion of precision. Here, the Dodge standard was enforced by government inspectors, men in gray suits with clipboards who didn't smile. They measured everything. A cylinder bore off by 10,000ths of an inch was scrap. A crankshaft out of balance by 5 grams was a failure. In early 1942, the rejection rate was a staggering 12%. 1 in 8 engines failed the test. To the workers, this wasn't just wasted metal. It was a personal failure. They knew that an engine stalling in the middle of a desert convoy meant a soldier's death. They implemented a ruthless new protocol. Every 50th engine was pulled from the line and completely disassembled, an industrial autopsy to find tool marks or microscopic cracks. But this perfection came at a human cost. In June 1943, a welder suffered third-degree burns when a gas line ruptured during overhead work, raining liquid fire onto his back. He spent 3 months in the hospital and returned in September, his neck scarred forever, a silent uniform of the home front. Then there was Walter Novak, a veteran machinist who lost 3 fingers to a spinning lathe when exhaustion slowed his reflexes by a fraction of a second. They didn't complain. There was no time for mourning. The war demanded output, and by late 1943, Dodge Main was delivering 12,000 engines a month. The impossible was becoming routine. By late 1943, the engines forged in the darkness of Hamtramck were screaming across every continent where American forces were deployed. But their greatest test came in the summer of 1944, after the breakout from Normandy. General George S. Patton's Third Army was moving at a pace that logistics officers called suicidal. His tanks were outrunning their own supply lines, consuming fuel and ammunition at a rate the world had never seen. To feed this insatiable monster, the Allied command created the Red Ball Express, a non-stop 24-hour conveyor belt of 6,000 trucks. The vast majority of these vehicles were powered by the Dodge T214. They ran on a one-way loop through the mud-choked ruins of France, driven by men who worked 12-hour shifts and slept in their cabs. The reliability of the Dodge Inline 6 became the stuff of legend. Mechanics in the field reported engines that ran for days without stopping, filters so clogged with French dust they looked like solid bricks, yet the pistons kept firing. They recognized the distinctive sound of a Dodge at idle, a steady, rhythmic pulse that meant help had arrived. Patton once said that the 2 most important weapons in his arsenal were the M1 Garand and the 2.5-ton truck. But it was the 18,000 workers in Detroit who ensured those trucks never stopped moving. They didn't just build engines, they built the legs of the liberation. The demand for engines never slackened, even as the war in Europe drew to a bloody close. But on April 12, 1945, the news that reached Hamtramck felt like a physical blow. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was dead. For the first time in 3 years, the relentless assembly line at Dodge Main went quiet. It wasn't because of a mechanical failure or a lack of parts. It was because the man who had led them through the Depression and most of the war had fallen. For 1 minute of silence, 18,000 workers bowed their heads. Then, the machines restarted. The war wasn't over. Less than a month later, Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe brought a brief, 15-minute stop to production, a moment for the workers to process a world without V-2 rockets or concentration camps. But there was no real celebration yet. Japan showed no signs of surrender, and the projected invasion, Operation Downfall, required even more engines, more trucks, more blood. It wasn't until August, after the atomic shadows fell over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the true celebration erupted. When the news of Japan's surrender hit the floor, the supervisors didn't bother to stop the exodus. Workers poured into the streets of Hamtramck, the sound of car horns and cheers drowning out the factory's hum for the last time. The final numbers were tallied: 418,647 engines. They had exceeded the contract by 18,000 units. Every single one had passed a merciless inspection. They had survived the war. Now they had to face the peace. The decades following the war were not kind to the Titan of Hamtramck. By 1980, the Dodge main plant had become an industrial dinosaur, a four-story relic in an age of streamlined, automated efficiency. Economics, the cold and unfeeling god of industry, demanded its end. In 1981, the wrecking balls arrived. For 6 months, the walls that had withstood the thunder of 10,000 stamping presses were reduced to dust. The site was cleared, leveled, and paved over. Today, an IKEA store occupies part of that hallowed ground. Shoppers push blue and yellow carts over the very spot where Helen Kowalski once measured camshafts to the 10,000th of an inch, completely unaware that they are walking on the foundations of the arsenal of democracy. But the story doesn't end with rubble. While the factory is gone, the T214 engines refuse to die. Across the globe, from the farms of Kansas to private museums in Belgium, the work of those 18,000 people is still breathing. When a collector turns the key on a restored Dodge WC truck, that rhythmic guttural hum is the exact same sound General Patton heard in 1944. It is a memorial in motion. The workers at Dodge Main didn't see themselves as heroes. They were ordinary people who understood that quality was a survival strategy. They built those engines as if their own sons' lives depended on every bolt, and in many cases, they did. As long as a single inline 6 from 1942 still turns over, the ghost of Hamtramck remains. Reliable, strong, unbreakable. This was how America built its way to victory.